Have you ever faced this paradox? Eating less, training harder, counting every calorie yet belly fat refuses to leave while your energy slowly disappears? If you've ever asked yourself, what am I doing wrong? Today's video may completely change how you understand fat loss. Welcome to Health Metabolic Science. In this episode, we break down burn fat faster with this insulin trick. 99% get it wrong. Here's the truth most people never hear. Your body does not lose fat through math. It loses fat through biology. And within that biology, there is one hormone that determines whether you are burning fat or storing it, regardless of calorie intake. That hormone is insulin. Many people try to lose fat by eating less, exercising more, and pushing harder. Yet the harder they push, the more exhausted, hungry, and skinny fat they become. Not because they are weak, but because they are sending the wrong biological signals. This video is not about starving yourself. It's not about eliminating carbs. It's not about extreme workouts. Instead, you'll learn how to control insulin intelligently by changing the order of foods, the timing of movement, and how your body handles energy so fat loss can happen without constant struggle. If you want to understand why your effort hasn't matched your results, subscribe to Health Metabolic Science and watch until the end. The real breakthrough isn't in burning fat faster, it's in finally understanding why your body resisted fat loss in the first place. To truly understand why most fat loss efforts fail, we need to stop at a critical point, one that the fitness industry has misunderstood for decades. It's the belief that the body works like a simple equation. Eat less, and fat will disappear. It sounds logical, but that logic only works on paper. Biology does not run on math. Biology runs on signals. Your body does not ask, how many calories did you eat today? It asks, am I in storage mode or usage mode? And the answer to that question is determined by one hormone, insulin. Imagine your body has two fuel tanks. The first is glycogen, stored sugar in the liver and muscles. It's small, easy to access, like cash in your wallet. The second is body fat, a massive energy reserve designed for long-term survival. This is your savings account. Biologically, the body's priority is not to burn fat first. Its priority is to protect fat because fat ensures survival in harsh conditions. Standing between these two fuel tanks is a powerful gatekeeper, insulin. Insulin is not simply a fat-storing hormone. It is an energy traffic controller. When insulin is low, the controller steps aside, and energy can be withdrawn from fat stores. When insulin is high, the controller returns, locks the vault, and says, external fuel is coming in. No need to access reserves. Here's the crucial detail. When insulin is high, fat burning is not just reduced, it is blocked. Biochemically, insulin directly suppresses lipolysis, the release of fatty acids from fat cells. In other words, insulin doesn't just command storage, it physically locks the exit doors. This creates the paradox that traps millions of people. You can eat very little, but if insulin remains high, fat burning is biologically forbidden. You can eat more food, yet still lose fat if insulin stays low and stable. This explains why some people starve themselves without results, while others eat more comfortably and lean out. It's not about moral discipline. It's about hormonal signaling. With chronically high insulin, the body enters a strange state. Energy, abundance with cellular starvation. Fat is plentiful, but inaccessible. Cells can't reach it. The brain senses shortage and triggers hunger. You crave food not because you are weak, but because your energy is locked away. This is why focusing only on how much you eat is insufficient. Two people can eat the same calories, yet their meal timing, sequence, and hormonal state produce opposite outcomes. One constantly spikes insulin through grazing and carb-first meals, keeping fat locked. The other allows insulin to fall between meals, naturally unlocking fat stores. The key takeaway here is this: fat loss is not a battle with food quantity. It is the skill of controlling a biological switch. Once you understand insulin as that switch, Many confusing experiences finally make sense: why fasting didn't work, why eating less made you tired, why belly fat felt impossible to lose, and from this understanding, every effective strategy begins. Because as long as you believe calories are the primary driver, you will rely on force. But when you understand that insulin controls access to fat, you move from punishment to signal alignment. And that is the moment your body stops resisting and starts responding. One of the most confusing and emotionally draining experiences for people trying to lose fat is this paradox. You are constantly hungry, yet your body refuses to lean out. Sometimes you feel hungry even right after eating. Society often labels this as a lack of discipline or willpower. But the deeper truth is very different. You are not overeating. You are trapped in a hormonal loop. When insulin remains chronically elevated, the body enters a biological paradox. On one hand, fat storage increases. On the other, cells cannot access that stored energy. High insulin doesn't just signal storage, it prevents fat release. The energy reserve exists, but the exit doors are locked. Imagine sitting on top of a vault full of money. But the key is gone. Technically, you are wealthy. Practically, you are broke. That is exactly what happens when insulin stays high. Energy is present, but unusable. The brain does not measure fat visually. It measures cellular energy availability. When cells cannot access fuel, the brain does not conclude we have plenty of fat. It concludes we are low on energy. Survival mechanisms activate immediately. Hunger signals increase. Cravings intensify. The brain pushes for fast, easily convertible foods, especially sugar and starch. This is not a personal failure. It is an ancient survival response. The problem is that in a modern environment of constant eating and insulin stimulation, this mechanism turns against you. The most dangerous part is that it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. High insulin blocks fat access. The brain signals hunger. You eat more, insulin rises further. Fat becomes even more inaccessible. In this loop, you are eating, starving at the cellular level, and gaining fat simultaneously. This is why so many people say, "I'm always hungry." Traditional advice tells you to eat less. But if hunger is caused not by lack of calories, but by lack of energy access, eating less only worsens the problem. You don't need less fuel. You need access to the fuel you already have. This is where most weight loss strategies fail. They reduce food intake without addressing chronically elevated insulin. The result is real hunger, increased stress, cortisol activation, and even tighter fat storage. You don't get leaner. You just get more exhausted. A key sign of this hormonal trap is eating without satisfaction. Not because food is insufficient, but because the brain never receives a stable energy signal. Insulin spikes, glucose handling is inefficient, blood sugar crashes, and hunger returns. You think you lack control. In reality, biology is driving the loop. The truth is simple. When insulin is low and stable, hunger quiets down naturally. There is no fight, no restraint, no internal battle. You simply aren't hungry. And that state doesn't come from willpower, it comes from correct biological signaling. So the real question is not, why do I eat so much? The real question is, why won't my body allow me to access fat? Once you ask the right question, self-blame dissolves. You realize the issue isn't who you are, it's the hormonal environment you've been living in. And when that environment changes, when insulin is no longer constantly elevated, hunger fades naturally. No punishment, no suffering, no war with yourself. If insulin is the switch that determines whether you burn fat or store it, then the way you begin a meal is the action that flips that switch. And this is where most people, even those who eat clean, make the biggest mistake without realizing it: eating in the wrong order. Look at how most meals are eaten. Bread arrives first. Rice, pasta, potatoes, or dessert are often consumed at the start. When the stomach is empty, at that moment, your digestive system is in maximum absorption mode. When carbohydrates or sugar enter first, the result is almost guaranteed. Blood glucose spikes rapidly. A rapid rise in glucose is treated as a threat by the body. Prolonged high glucose can damage tissues and blood vessels. So the pancreas responds like it's handling an emergency, releasing a large, fast surge of insulin to clear sugar from the bloodstream. In that moment, your body exits energy usage mode and switches directly into storage mode. The first result is fat being locked away. The second result follows shortly after, a blood sugar crash. When insulin overshoots, glucose drops too low. The brain interprets this as an energy crisis. Survival signals activate sleepiness, mental fog, loss of focus, and intense sugar cravings. Not because you lack discipline, but because the brain is trying to restore glucose as fast as possible. And so, a familiar loop forms. Carbs first, insulin spike, fat storage, glucose crash, cravings, more eating, another insulin spike. This is the modern fat storage cycle, repeating daily while people believe they're eating normally. Here's the critical insight. You can eat the same foods in the same amounts, but a different order produces a completely different biological outcome. This is the insulin trick the video introduces. It doesn't require eliminating carbs. It doesn't demand extreme restriction. It simply requires changing the sequence in which food enters the body. Biologically, food order determines the speed at which glucose enters the bloodstream. Carbs first rush directly into the small intestine and are absorbed rapidly. But when fiber, protein, and fat come first, digestion slows. Glucose no longer floods the blood like a tsunami. It enters gradually, allowing the body to manage energy without triggering insulin alarms. Most people try to fix the aftermath crashes, fatigue, cravings with coffee, snacks, or willpower. But the root problem isn't lack of control. It's how the meal was initiated. A powerful storage signal was sent at the very first bite. Insulin itself is not the enemy. It becomes problematic when it is triggered too fast, too high, and too often. Food sequencing controls all three. You don't need to abandon familiar meals. You need to reassign their position in the meal. Once this clicks, many mysteries resolve themselves. Post-meal fatigue, afternoon cravings, constant hunger despite eating. Not because your body is greedy, but because you unintentionally activated an ancient biological reflex. This is why the video says 99% get it wrong. People try to lose fat by eating less, when simply changing food order would completely alter hormonal signaling. With the right sequence, insulin spikes flatten, blood sugar stabilizes, hunger quiets, and, most importantly, fat stores are no longer locked all day. This isn't a hack, it's biology. And once you apply it, you realize fat loss doesn't have to be a battle. Sometimes, it's just eating the same meal in the right order. Step 1. Fiber Firewall. Once you understand that food order determines whether you burn fat or store it, the next logical question is, how should a meal begin? Science offers a surprisingly simple answer that has been overlooked for decades. This is why the insulin trick starts with Fiber Firewall. Fiber Firewall means that the first thing to enter your digestive system is not sugar or starch, but fiber-rich vegetables, leafy greens, broccoli, spinach, asparagus, cabbage, cucumbers. Foods often treated as side dishes play a central biological role here. The first thing to understand is that fiber is not fuel. The human body cannot digest fiber the way it digests sugar or starch. Because fiber isn't rapidly broken down, it does not trigger insulin. When you eat fiber first, you are not signaling energy is flooding in. You are signaling something very different. Slow down. As fiber enters the stomach and small intestine, it forms a viscous structure like a biological mesh coating the intestinal lining. This mesh doesn't block nutrients, but it slows their absorption. This is critical, because insulin doesn't react strongly to how much carbohydrate you eat. It reacts to how fast glucose appears in the bloodstream. This is a key point most people were never taught. The same amount of carbohydrate can be metabolically neutral if it enters slowly, or metabolically disruptive if it floods in rapidly. Fiber firewall is how you flatten the glucose curve from the very first minutes of the meal. Another powerful effect of fiber first eating is its impact on the nervous system and satiety signals. When fiber stretches the gut, mechanoreceptors send a message to the brain. Food is arriving, prepare, but don't panic. This naturally slows eating without effort. Slower eating leads to slower insulin release. Many people believe insulin control requires extreme restriction. Fiber firewall proves the opposite. You don't need to change what you eat, only how you begin eating. A simple salad before the main course can create a larger hormonal benefit than cutting hundreds of calories. A common mistake is treating vegetables as optional. In the context of insulin, vegetables are regulatory tools. When you skip fiber and begin a meal with bread, rice, or dessert, you remove the protective barrier. Glucose rushes in, insulin spikes aggressively, and the entire meal shifts into storage mode. Fiber firewall does more than blunt insulin. It also supports gut microbiota. Fiber feeds beneficial bacteria, lowering baseline inflammation. Lower inflammation improves insulin sensitivity. One small change at the start of a meal creates a cascade effect. Glucose, insulin, inflammation, metabolism. You don't need perfection. You don't need massive bowls of vegetables. You only need enough to create a buffer. A small salad, steamed vegetables, or simple sautéed greens are sufficient to change biological signaling. With consistent use, fiber firewall produces subtle but powerful changes. Less post-meal fatigue, steadier blood sugar, longer-lasting satiety, and fewer sugar cravings. Not through force, but because the brain no longer senses an emergency. Fiber firewall is the first step of the insulin trick because it sets the rhythm of the entire meal. When this rhythm is right, protein, fats, and carbohydrates can play their roles correctly. Insulin control stops being a fight. It becomes a biological sequence, and fiber is the opening note. Step 2. Protein plus fat anchor. If fiber firewall is the first protective layer that slows glucose entry into the bloodstream, then protein plus fat anchor is the stabilizing force that keeps the entire digestive system from being swept away by insulin. This step is often misunderstood because protein is usually seen only as a muscle-building nutrient, not as a powerful hormonal regulator. Once fiber has set a slower rhythm for digestion, protein and healthy fats reinforce that rhythm. Meat, fish, eggs, full-fat dairy, avocado, olive oil. These are not just calories. They are biological signals telling the body, energy is arriving steadily. There is no emergency. Physiologically, protein stimulates the release of GLP, one glucagon-like peptide. 1. A hormone produced in the gut that plays a crucial role in fat loss. First, GLP-1 slows gastric emptying. Food stays in the stomach longer instead of rushing into the small intestine. Slower digestion means glucose enters the bloodstream gradually, preventing sharp insulin spikes. This is how insulin curves flatten without eliminating food. Second, GLP-1 sends satiety signals directly to the brain. This is not the uncomfortable fullness of overeating, but a calm sense of enough. The mental debate about eating more disappears because the brain recognizes stable energy processing. When the brain feels secure, it stops pushing for additional intake. Third, GLP-1 reduces the total amount of insulin required to handle a meal. This is especially important for insulin-resistant individuals. Instead of shouting with insulin, the body communicates more effectively. Lower insulin means less fat storage. This is where natural biology overlaps with modern medicine. Popular GLP-1 weight loss drugs work by mimicking or extending this signal. What's often overlooked is that GLP-1 can be activated naturally through proper protein intake, timing, and sequencing without injections or artificial intervention. Healthy fats play a complementary role. They increase satiety, extend digestion time, and stabilize post-meal blood sugar. When protein is paired with fat, the slowing effect becomes stronger, like dropping an anchor that steadies a ship against the current. Many fear fat intake, assuming fat causes fat gain. In the context of insulin, the opposite is often true. Fat does not spike insulin, and when consumed at the right time, it helps prevent excessive insulin release. This protein-fat combination creates a stable metabolic foundation rather than letting carbohydrates dictate hormonal responses. With protein plus fat anchor in place, common post-meal problems fade. No energy crashes, no lingering hunger, no random snacking hours later. Not because of discipline, but because the brain has received accurate metabolic information. You don't need excessive protein. You need adequate protein, enough to activate GLP-1 and signal biological safety. When the body feels safe, it doesn't cling to fat, and when storage pressure lifts, fat is finally allowed to leave. Protein plus fat anchor is not a diet trick. It is a lesson in how to teach the body to handle energy correctly. Placed after fiber firewall, it creates two protective layers before carbohydrates appear. At that point, carbs are no longer disruptive. They become manageable fuel. This is why step 2 is non-negotiable. If fiber is the barrier, protein and fat are the structural pillars that support hormonal balance. When those pillars are strong, insulin stops being a dictator and becomes a servant acting at the right time with the right intensity. Step 3. Last carbohydrate. After building the fiber firewall and dropping the protein plus fat anchor, carbohydrates finally enter the scene. This is the most surprising part for many people. Because unlike extreme diets, the insulin trick does not eliminate carbs. It simply asks you to place carbohydrates in their proper biological position. When carbs are eaten last, the internal environment is completely different. The stomach is no longer empty. The intestine is coated with fiber. Gastric emptying has slowed due to protein and fat. In this context, carbohydrates no longer hit the bloodstream like a flood. They arrive as a controlled, steady stream. Here's the key principle. Insulin doesn't react aggressively to the presence of glucose, but to the speed at which glucose appears in the blood. When carbs come last, glucose drips in instead of rushing in. The pancreas doesn't need to sound an alarm. Insulin rises modestly, does its job, and comes back down. Fat isn't locked away for hours. There's no reactive crash afterward. The benefits appear quickly. No heavy post-meal drowsiness. Clearer thinking. Longer-lasting satiety without sugar cravings. Most importantly, the body receives a different message. Energy is arriving in an orderly way. No need to store. Research on food sequencing shows that eating the same meal, same calories, but in the order fiber, protein plus fat carbs, can reduce post-meal glucose peaks by over 70% and lower insulin spikes by nearly 5%. That's the difference between a fat-storing meal and a metabolically neutral one. When insulin rises less, fat is not locked away as long. The fat vault can reopen between meals, which is essential for metabolic flexibility. The body uses glucose when available, then smoothly switches to fat without triggering energy stress. A common misconception is that carbs are inherently bad. They aren't. The real issue is carbs arriving too early in an unprepared system. Eating carbs on an empty stomach forces insulin into overdrive. Eating carbs after proper preparation allows insulin to do its job gently and briefly. Step 3 also resolves a common fear. If I eat carbs, I'll lose all fat loss progress. In reality, when carbs are eaten last, you don't sabotage fat loss, you optimize it. The body feels safe, not threatened. And, in a state of safety, it's willing to release stored fat. Even more importantly, carbs last supports real life. You don't have to reject family meals, celebrations, or cultural foods. You simply eat them after setting the right biological foundation. Fat loss becomes sustainable, not a constant battle. When all 3 steps come together, the insulin trick reveals itself as a complete biological sequence, not a collection of hacks. Fiber sets the pace. Protein and fat stabilize it. Carbohydrates finish the meal in a safe environment. The food stays the same, but the hormonal response is entirely different. And that difference, not willpower, determines whether fat is burned or stored. Eating carbs last isn't about restriction. It's about working with biology instead of against it. Once the 3 steps of the insulin trick are in place, fiber, setting the pace, protein and fat stabilizing it, and carbohydrates arriving last, you've already transformed the hormonal response of a meal. But biology often offers small levers that amplify big results. One of the simplest and most overlooked is apple cider vinegar. Apple cider vinegar is not a miracle. It doesn't burn fat directly. But in the right context, acetic acid, its active compound, can smooth the entire carbohydrate handling process. This effect is biochemical, not psychological. First, acetic acid partially inhibits enzymes responsible for breaking down starch, slowing the conversion of starch into glucose. Digestion still occurs, but at a reduced speed. And as we've established, speed, not quantity, is what drives insulin response. Slower glucose appearance means the pancreas doesn't need to trigger an emergency. Insulin rises lower and shorter, then returns to baseline sooner. Second, and especially valuable for insulin-resistant individuals, acetic acid improves insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue. Think of insulin as a messenger. In insulin resistance, muscle cells hear poorly, forcing the pancreas to release more insulin. Acetic acid helps cells hear the signal more clearly, allowing less insulin to do the same job. Less insulin means less fat storage pressure. The key distinction is this: apple cider vinegar does not raise insulin. It helps the body use insulin more efficiently. That's optimization, not force. Practical use is simple. 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar diluted in water, taken a few minutes before a meal. That's enough time for acetic acid to begin interacting with digestion. More is not better. It's a catalyst, not the foundation. The foundation remains meal sequencing. A valuable side benefit is smoother post-meal energy. With lower glucose peaks and gentler declines, the familiar post-meal crash fades. Sugar cravings decrease not through restraint, but because the brain no longer senses instability. It's important to note that apple cider vinegar isn't suitable for everyone. Those with sensitive stomachs, severe reflux, or dental issues should dilute carefully and assess tolerance. The goal is not endurance, but biological ease. Even without vinegar, the 3-step sequence delivers most of the benefit. Most importantly, vinegar must be used in the correct role. It cannot rescue a poorly sequenced meal. If carbs are eaten first on an empty stomach, insulin will spike regardless. Vinegar works best within a proper sequence, acting like a shock absorber, smoothing the ride, not changing the direction. Integrated into the insulin trick, apple cider vinegar adds an extra biochemical buffer. Starch breaks down more slowly. Glucose enters the bloodstream more gradually, insulin remains lower, and muscles absorb energy more efficiently. Each link supports the same outcome: less storage signaling, more usage signaling. These small, sustainable adjustments, not extreme measures, create lasting change. Fat loss isn't about doing something intense for a short time. It's about doing many things right, gently enough to sustain over time. Used correctly, apple cider vinegar is one of those small details that completes the biological picture. Once meal sequencing and insulin control are in place, many people assume the next step is simply burning more calories. That assumption is why 99% of people get movement wrong. Not because they lack effort, but because they move at the wrong biological time. The most common mistake is fasted cardio or exercising far away from meals. It sounds logical: train on an empty stomach to burn fat. But for many overweight or insulin-resistant individuals, this approach is often counterproductive. Training while fasted, especially under stress or sleep deprivation, tends to raise cortisol. Elevated cortisol triggers glucose production in the liver, increasing blood sugar and indirectly raising insulin. The result is more fatigue, more hunger, and less fat-burning benefit than expected. The correct approach is surprisingly simple. A 10–15-minute walk immediately after eating. No running, no HIIT, no exhaustion, just timely muscle activation. The reason lies in a critical biological doorway called GLUT4. When muscles contract, GLUT4 transporters move to the muscle cell surface, allowing glucose to enter muscles directly without insulin. In other words, post-meal movement creates a parallel exit for blood sugar. Instead of relying on insulin to force glucose into cells and pushing excess into fat, muscles pull glucose in to use as fuel. This produces three cascading benefits: lower glucose peaks, smaller and shorter insulin spikes, reduced post-meal fat storage. Most importantly, walking after meals does not increase stress. It doesn't trigger cortisol. It doesn't signal danger. It simply tells the body, energy is being used now. And when energy is used, storage is unnecessary. If post-meal movement addresses insulin spikes, the next layer addresses a deeper issue: basal insulin. Many overweight individuals don't struggle because of individual meals. They struggle because insulin remains elevated even when they are not eating, including during sleep. This is known as high basal insulin. When basal insulin is high, several consequences follow. First, you wake up hungry. Not because you need food, but because insulin locked fat overnight, preventing access to stored energy. The brain senses shortage and signals hunger immediately. Second, fat burning remains suppressed even during fasting. This is why some people practice intermittent fasting without losing belly fat. The issue isn't fasting itself, it's that basal insulin hasn't dropped low enough to unlock fat. The root cause of elevated basal insulin is usually constant eating, grazing, and lack of true biological quiet time. Every bite raises insulin slightly. When this happens all day, insulin never gets a chance to return to zero. The solution is not eating less, but eating within defined windows. No snacking, no constant nibbling. Time-restricted eating creates long enough periods for insulin to truly fall. When basal insulin drops, fat becomes accessible fuel, and when fat is accessible, hunger naturally quiets. By combining post-meal walking with clear eating windows, you address both sides of insulin regulation: lower spikes after meals and lower baseline levels between meals. This is when the body develops metabolic flexibility, using glucose when available and fat when not, without stress. At this point, many people experience something new. Food no longer controls them. They eat when needed and stop when satisfied. Not through discipline, but because biology has been aligned correctly. When we step back and look at everything we've covered, the most important takeaway is not a fat loss trick, but a shift in how you understand your body. You didn't gain fat because you lack discipline. You didn't fail because of weak willpower. And your metabolism is not broken. Your body has simply been responding correctly to the biological signals it was given. For years, you were taught to eat less, train harder, and push more. But biology doesn't respond to force. It responds to safety and order. When insulin stays high, cortisol remains elevated, snacking never stops, and movement happens at the wrong time, the body chooses storage not to sabotage you, but to protect you. Everything changes when you stop fighting and start realigning signals. When you eat in the right sequence. When you move at the right time. When you allow insulin real periods of rest. The body doesn't need persuasion. It responds automatically. Hunger quiets. Energy stabilizes. Fat begins to release without punishment. This isn't magic. It's biology being respected. Health metabolic science doesn't exist to make you fast longer or live more restrictively. It exists to help you understand your body deeply enough that you no longer need to blame, punish, or doubt yourself when progress stalls. If this video helped you realize that the problem was never who you are, but how biological signals were misaligned, subscribe to Health Metabolic Science. Here, we don't chase weight loss through fear. We build health through understanding, calm, and sustainability. And if you remember only one thing from this video, let it be this: you don't need to control your body with willpower. You only need to create the conditions for biology to do its job.